Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into something that's pretty important for anyone who wants to understand how India really works, the powers of the governor.
Yeah, it's a topic that often gets kind of overshadowed, by all the drama of elections and those parliamentary debates. But the governor's role is absolutely crucial to how smoothly our democracy runs.
So let's imagine this. Each state in India has its own mini parliament, kind of like what we have at the national level, with a chief minister and a council of ministers.
Yeah.
But then at the top, you've got the governor, and this is someone who's appointed, not elected. So our main source material for this deep dive is the Indian Constitution. So I guess we should start there, right?
Absolutely. The Constitution basically lays out the whole blueprint for this unique position. And it's really interesting because the governor has to wear two hats. So they're the head honcho of their state, constitutionally speaking, but they're also representing the central government and, more specifically, the president.
That dual role sounds like it could get a little sticky. I mean, talk about being caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, you got it. And that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. I mean, we're going to be looking at how this dual role actually plays out in the real world, the kind of surprising powers the governor has. And, do they really just rubber stamp whatever their council of ministers decides?
Okay, so let's unpack this a little. First things first, how do you even become a governor?
Well, it's definitely not a popularity contest. The governor is appointed by the president, and the Constitution only lists two basic qualifications. You have to be an Indian citizen and at least 35 years old.
So theoretically, I could be a governor. On second thought, maybe not such a good idea.
Well, maybe. But beyond those basic things, there are some unwritten rules or conventions that have evolved over the years. For example, the governor should ideally be an outsider, not someone who's super involved in the politics of the state they're sent to govern.
Right. It's like having a neutral referee for a high-stakes game.
Yeah.
But why is there so much emphasis on staying neutral?
Well, think of it this way. When they were creating our Constitution, they wanted to make sure the governor could stay kind of impartial and not get dragged into all the local political stuff. They saw the governor as a stabilizing force.
Yeah.
Someone who could rise above the political parties and just uphold the Constitution.
Okay, starting to see the logic here. But let's be real. Indian politics is rarely ever neutral. I'm guessing there have been times when these conventions have been kind of conveniently ignored.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, history's full of examples where these conventions were bent or broken or just completely ignored, and that often led to clashes between the governor and the state government. We'll definitely get into some of those juicy examples a little later.
Can't wait. But before we get to all that drama, let's lay the groundwork. What kind of powers does a governor actually have?
The governor's powers are surprisingly extensive, and they're basically grouped into four main categories: executive, legislative, financial, and judicial. And trust me, some of these powers can really change the game.
Okay, let's start with the executive powers then. What can the governor actually do in that area?
Well, they have the power to appoint the chief minister. Now, in situations where one party wins a clear majority in the state assembly, it's usually a pretty straightforward process. But imagine a scenario where no single party gets a majority, what we call a hung assembly.
Hung assembly. That's when things start to get really interesting. It's like a political game of musical chairs with everyone scrambling for power.
Exactly. And in those cases, the governor gets to decide who they'll invite to form the government. They basically become a kingmaker. Just think about the weight of that responsibility. The governor's decision can literally determine the whole political landscape of a state.
Wow, that's serious power. So what happens once the chief minister is in place? Does the governor just step back and let them run the show?
Not really. The governor still plays an active role. They have the authority to get information from the chief minister about governance issues, to ensure some accountability. They can also send bills back to the state legislature for reconsideration, acting as a check on the whole legislative process.
Interesting. So it's not just appointing the chief minister. It's about keeping an eye on them and making sure they're playing by the rules.
Precisely. And in really extreme cases, if the governor thinks the whole constitutional machinery in the state has broken down, they can actually recommend president's rule.
Whoa, president's rule. That's like hitting the reset button on a whole state government, isn't it? It's a pretty drastic measure.
It is indeed. And it really highlights the governor's role as a safeguard, against political instability or a situation where the state government just can't function properly. But that's really just the beginning when it comes to the governor's executive powers. They also play a crucial role in maintaining law and order in the state, making sure the administration runs smoothly, and representing the state at all those ceremonial functions.
Okay. I'm starting to see how the governor's role is a lot more than just symbolic. They got some real power when it comes to the executive stuff. But what about the legislative powers? I'm guessing they have a say in how laws are made in a state, right?
Absolutely. The governor plays a key role in the whole legislative process. They have the power to summon and dissolve the state legislature, which is basically like controlling when the state parliament can meet.
That sounds like a pretty powerful tool.
Yeah.
Imagine being able to decide when the legislative assembly gets to meet and debate laws.
It definitely is. And it shows just how much influence the governor has over how laws are made. Boy, there's more. The governor also has a say in whether a bill actually passes. They can give their assent to a bill, making it a law, or they can withhold their assent, basically blocking it.
So even if a bill is passed by the state legislature with a majority vote, the governor can still stop it.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, this power has caused a lot of debate and controversy throughout India's political history. We'll definitely unpack some real-world examples of how this power has been used. And trust me, some of them are pretty intense.
All right, so we've covered the power to call the legislature into session and end its session, and the power to approve or reject bills. Is there anything else the governor can do in this legislative arena?
This is where it gets even more interesting. The governor can also send a bill back to the legislature for reconsideration, suggesting changes or amendments. And in certain cases, they can even reserve a bill for the president to consider.
Hold on, reserving a bill for the president. That sounds like it could cause some serious friction between the state and central governments.
It certainly can. Imagine a scenario where a state legislature dominated by a particular party passes a bill, and the governor representing the president and maybe a different party at the center isn't happy with it. The governor can step in and say, hold up, I need to send this up the chain of command for a final decision.
That's a pretty powerful tool for the central government to control state legislatures, especially when those legislatures are ruled by opposing parties.
You got it. It's a mechanism that makes sure the central government has some oversight on state legislation, especially when it comes to matters of national importance. But like you said, it can also cause tension and political maneuvering. It's all part of the fascinating power dynamics that we're exploring in this deep dive.
All right, so the governor's not just sitting on the sidelines when it comes to lawmaking. They've got the power to influence, delay, and even potentially block laws from being passed. Now I'm really starting to see why this position is so crucial to understanding how Indian democracy works.
Right. And we've barely scratched the surface of the governor's legislative powers. They also have a say in how the state budget is created and presented. No money bill can even be introduced in the state legislature without the governor's recommendation. Think of them like a gatekeeper, making sure the state's finances are being handled responsibly.
So they're not just a rubber stamp when it comes to money matters. Interesting. But what about judicial powers? Can the governor pardon criminals?
Well, they might not have a gavel to bang, but they do have some pretty significant judicial powers. The governor can grant pardons, reprieves, and reduce punishments. They can also suspend, remit, or commute sentences. However, there's one important exception. They can't pardon a death sentence.
That's interesting. So the governor has a lot of say in the justice system, but there are limits. It's like they have a powerful toolkit, but some tools are off limits. Why is that?
That power belongs solely to the president. It reflects how serious a death sentence is and the need for a higher authority to make that decision.
All right, so we've covered the governor's executive, legislative, and judicial powers, and it's clear that this position is far from just ceremonial.
Yeah.
They have real authority and influence.
Exactly. And to really understand the scope of their power, we need to look at a concept that's often debated and sometimes misused: discretion.
Discretion. What does that even mean when we're talking about the governor?
Simply put, it means the governor can act on their own without having to follow the advice of their council of ministers. Now, there are two types of discretion: constitutional and situational.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
Constitutional discretion is specifically mentioned in the Constitution. For example, the governor can reserve a bill for the president to look at using their own discretion. They don't need the council of ministers to agree. Situational discretion, on the other hand, comes up based on the specific circumstances. Imagine a hung assembly where no party has a clear majority. The governor then gets to decide who to invite to form the government.
So situational discretion is more like, it depends discretion. That sounds like a recipe for political drama and a lot of pressure on the governor to make the right call.
You got it. And we've seen lots of examples of both types of discretion in India's political history. Some were celebrated as wise leadership, and others were condemned as blatant political maneuvering. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into next.
This is getting juicy. We've explored the governor's dual role, their powers across the board, and now this whole concept of